I want to thank Mrs. Tihana Ilic for organizing all this and for having suffered me for 5 days. She deserves, definitely. Definitely deserves. And not to mention the milk and honey. Yeah. I was about to thank my wife, but I think I will have to thank the cigarette. I told them you abandoned me for a cigarette. Must be a very special cigarette. They call them cigarettes nowadays. So on this occasion, I would also like to thank my wife, long-suffering wife, Lydia Rangelovska, without which none of this would have happened because I was about to give up the field. And she convinced me, under threat of a gun, to stay and to work. And so this is the first thing we did together, but not the last. That's our book, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. So this was a joint production. No, it's okay. That's coming in. These applause are for you. One service announcement before we continue. Those of you who did not pay the electricity bills, you have a... No, I'm kidding. One service announcement. My seminars and lectures are free of charge. So I do not charge for seminars and lectures. If any of you, because some of you have approached me and so on, if any of you wish to organize seminars and lectures wherever, I'm going all over the world, from Canada to Romania so I come at my expense, I don't charge anything, I cover all my expenses and so on. You are free, free to ask me, and I'd be delighted to come. That was my way of telling you how rich I am. Okay, Shoshanim. Please stand up. And now sit down. When I ask you to stand up, I did not provide you with a reason. I just said, please stand up. You provided you with a reason. And there were three camps. There are three camps among you. There are those who speculated on my state of mind. There are those who speculated on what is appropriate to do. And there are those who were self-concerned, concerned with themselves. So there are those who said, you know, he has the common cold, he's drinking milk with honey, better not to F with him, you know, we will do what he wants. This kind of process is known as mentalization. You were constructing a theory of mind, in this case, my mind. Of course, you made the assumption that I have one. So, this is mentalization, theory of mind. The second type of explanation is about society, societal roles, and how people interact with each other within interpersonal relationships. So, for example, when a professor asks you to stand up, you stand up, because that's the dumb thing in society. And this is known as internal working model. Internal working model was first proposed by John Bowlby, and it's the way we conceive of the appropriateness or lack of appropriateness of interactions with other people in a variety of settings, intimate settings, institutional settings. We, all of us, have dozens of internal working models, and we have theories of mind. Theory of mind could be a general thing. This is how people think, this is what makes people tick, this is what motivates people, this is what, you know, this is a general theory of mind. And you could have highly specific theories of mind. For example, theory of mind about Samvaknin. That's a highly specific theory of mind. Then there is a third group that says, I better get up, because if I don't get up and everyone else gets up, I would look weird. Or some vaknin will punish me with another half hour of the seminar. Or something horrible will happen, equally horrible. So these are the three camps. Now the third camp is actually, I'm sorry to inform those of you who engaged in this kind of explanation, is actually pathological. It's a pathology. Healthy people react by activating a theory of mind or by activating an internal working model. If they don't use a theory of mind and they don't use an internal working model, but instead they use what we call a self-referential model, that is a pathology. Narcissists do that. Psychopaths do that. What's in it for me? What's in it for me? Why should I do that? You know, so I made you get up and down, sit down in order to demonstrate this. Why is this important? You remember the mother? This is wrong somehow. No? Is something wrong with this?
Can I touch you?
No, no, no.
Please.
Don't raise your hopes too high. It's only the shirt.
He's only mine.
It's only the shirt. It's not going any further, you have my word.
But nothing without room.
Woman's touch.
Yes.
Just a
She
second.
has just given me my voice.
Just a second.
Yes? Video?
No.
Seminar?
No.
Right, fine.
The mother.
Yes, the mother, apropos the mother. Erik Erikson called this phase the basic trust phase. It's when a good enough mother, in the language of Winnicott, a mother who is a secure base, a mother who feels safe, a mother who is there, responsive, caring, and as I said, a mother who frustrates the child, who pushes the child away, who encourages personal autonomy in the child, independence of the child. This kind of mother allows the child to grasp, to understand that other people exist. It's like mother is the testing ground, is the boot camp, is the initial experience. The child says, mother exists, mother is external, mother is separate. Oh, then, so is the neighbor, or so is my classmate. Or so the child extrapolates from the experience with the mother and begins to accept and glom and realize the separateness and externality of other people. In other words, such a mother is a condition for mentalization. It is the existence of such a mother in the personal history that allows the child to develop a theory of mind about other people who are external, who are separate. So the child can develop a theory of mind, and the child develops an internal working model, a model that informs the child on how human relationships work. And this is based on the relationship with the mother. The mother is a prototype. If the prototype is wrong, not working, like iPhone 1, then it's a problem later on. Stephen Jobs lost his job, by the way, because of that. So, the mother's gaze, and when I say gaze, it's a generalized thing. Gaze means caring. Gaze means being present. Gaze means observing. Gaze means enabling the child to explore the world, supporting the child's grandiosity. All this is gaze. When the mother's gaze is there, and the mother is a good enough mother, the child will mentalize, will create theories of mind. Mentalization is a concept that was mostly developed by Peter Fonagy, the famous psychoanalyst, yes? Peter Fonagy. So, a child will mentalize, and the child will create internal working. So, children who are exposed to dead mothers, Guntrip called the dead mother, British, Guntrip called the dead mother frustrating, rejecting mother. So it's the same. When there is a dead mother in the background of the child, the child grows up without the capacity to perceive the external existence and separateness of other people, doesn't see the need to develop a theory of mind because his mind, her mind is one, it's melded, it's fused, merged, and does not develop an internal, or actually develops an internal working model which is dysfunctional. And this is what is known as insecure attachment style. So, a dead mother completely destroys the child's capacity to relate to other people. In other words, she destroys object relations. Object relations are undermined by the existence of a dead mother or a frustrating, rejecting mother. And such a child has severe problems relating to other people. And in a minute we'll see how the child solves this. But even worse, the child, because the child is capable of relating only to a mother, the child never graduated. The child never graduated from this is mother, and then there are others. So I can relate to mother, but then I can relate to others. And then I can forget about mother and relate only to others. Yeah? Child doesn't graduate. Child remains stuck with mother. So everyone is a mother. After that, everyone is a mother. In order for this kind of child, when he grows up and becomes adult, for this kind of child to relate to other people, he needs to convert them into mothers, into maternal figures. But the original mother was frustrating, was rejecting, was unpleasant, was absent. That's not a good model. It's not a good mother. It was a bad mother. So everyone becomes a bad mother. Simply. The maternal object imposed by this kind of child when he grows up, imposed on other people, is an object that is rejecting, frustrating, withholding, avoiding, an object that is malevolent, malicious. The object is doing it on purpose. The object is frustrating me on purpose. The object is rejecting me deliberately. It creates paranoid ideation, and the object becomes what we call persecutory object. It's a persecutory object. So, these kind of children, when they grow up, they internalize persecutory objects. In a minute, we will discuss relationships, how this translates in a relationship through something called the shared fantasy. This child grows up with no mentalization, no theory of mind, no internal working models which are functional, and no ego, no self, no boundaries. There's been a massive disruption in ego formation, in self formation, call it as you wish. The process didn't end. Even if we believe, like me for example, we believe that there is no such a thing as self. I believe that the concept is counterfactual and sometimes comic. I don't believe there is a unitary self. I don't believe in a core identity. I think these are completely deranged concepts. Anyone who works with people knows that people are not lakes, people are not ponds, people are rivers. They flow. And Pantarei, you cannot enter the same river twice, it all flows. So, but even if you believe in what is known as a theory of self-states, an assemblage of self-states that are reactive to the environment. And so we have work by Philip Bromberg. We have complexes in Jung, which are reminiscent of this. We have internal family system with the parts. We have many such theories around subpersonalities, pseudoidentities, many theories, ego state therapy. There are many schools in psychology that believe that there is no such thing as a self or an ego. But we have a variety of actors and agents that are responsive to the environment. They take over, the others become dormant, and vice versa. But even then, the assembly of self-states acts in the best interest of the individual. It's a self-efficacious assembly. The principle governing the self-states is a principle of self-efficacy, to maximize the beneficial outcomes from the environment. The child who has been exposed to a dead mother is not self-efficacious. is not self-efficacious because this kind of child has no agency. This kind of child is an extension. This kind of child is an avatar. It's just, this child is an internal object. It's not real. So he has no self-efficacy. And so he is not able to act within the environment in an efficacious way. And instead, this kind of child chooses fantasy. The solution is fantasy. Because reality is unyielding, reality is challenging, reality is hurtful and painful, reality is undermining, and reality is demanding. The alternative, which is much more controllable, much more malleable, much more responsive, is fantasy. And fantasy shapes the lives of these kind of children. But the fantasy is a sad fantasy. Because the two underlying emotions are grief and shame. These are the two underlying emotions of such children. Now, to be clear, children who were brought up by dead mothers, they're dead. They walk, they talk, they even give lectures, but they're dead. Deep inside, they're dead. There's nobody there. Nobody. It's an absence. It's a simulacrum, simulation. So because they are dead inside, these children who became adults, they are unable to access positive emotions. Positive emotions are associated with pain, with hurt, with rejection, with frustration. So they avoid positive emotions. They repress them, if you want to use Freudian terms. They repress positive emotions. They have no access in any case. They are unable to experience positive emotions at all. However, they have full access to negative affectivity. Negative affectivity, anger, hatred, envy. Envy is a motivating force and so on. And the reason they have full access to negative affects is twofold. One, it's a simulation of self-efficacy. Like if I cannot be really self-efficacious, I can be great at destroying things. If I cannot build things, I can destroy them. If I cannot accomplish things, I can imitate or destroy the object of my envy. It is through my anger and fury and rage that I make people do what I want. These emotions render me efficacious, self-efficacious. That's one thing. But there is a deeper thing. Negative affectivity is a defense. It's a defense, or what we call in earlier psychology, displacement. It's a displacement activity. This kind of child experiences negative affects that protect the child from experiencing other negative affects. So this kind of child displaces. The child displaces from shame and from sadness and displaces from these emotions, from grief, from shame, to envy, anger, and so on. So these are protective displacement mechanisms in order to not experience the shame and the grief. What is this shame? What does a child grieve? What is this mourning process? It is very shameful to be helpless. It is very shameful to be abused. It's very shameful to be ignored. It's doubly shameful if your mother is doing this. It's a feeling that you're unlovable, unworthy. It's what we call an internalized bad object. It's as if you are a nobody, piece of trash, nothing. And it's very shameful, it's humiliating. It's a sense of constant humiliation. And on the other hand, you grieve. Even as a child, you grieve. And anyone who says that children are incapable of grieving doesn't know what they're talking about. I had the dubious pleasure of raising my 3 brothers and 1 sister, and I can tell you, children grieve. So there is grief. And the grief is over the relationship with the mother, which is not as it should be. The grief is about the inability to become, the inability to self-actualize, to use Maslow's term. Yeah? You cannot self-actualize, you cannot realize your potentials, you cannot become. You're not allowed to become. You're not allowed to be an individual. Dead mothers impede they obstruct, they hinder what Margaret Mahler called the separation individuation phase. According to Margaret Mahler, and this is commonly accepted nowadays, there was a debate at the time, nowadays it's accepted. According to Margaret Mahler, around the age of 18 months, the child begins to separate from mother. And by separating, because separation has multiple phases, rapprochement, this, that, never mind all that. So it is through separation that the child becomes. You become by negating mother, in effect. That's an unpleasant fact. It is by rejecting mother, in effect, that you become. That's why the child is terrified of punishment. That's why a mother who is insecure and punishes the child when the child separates, hinders the separation, obstructs it. But many mothers would punish because it's a rejection of mother. It's experienced as rejection. So around 18 months, the child separates and becomes an individual, and a dead mother does not allow this. She does not allow this either because she is protective, overprotective, holding, insecure, depressive, and uses the child as an instrument, or instrumentalizes, or parentifies, whatever it is, or she doesn't allow the separation because she doesn't provide a gaze. Separate from who? From whom? If there's nobody there, if the mother is absent, if the mother couldn't care less, if the mother is, on the contrary, depressive, or if she's narcissistic, or in all these situations, whom can the child separate from? There's no counterparty. So this also destroys the separation individuation process. Consequently, this child remains stuck in what used to be known as the symbiotic phase. The child remains melded and meshed, merged and fused with his mother. It is, of course, in due time, a symbolic mother, the introjected mother, the internal object that represents mother in the child's mind. Mother could die physically, and still this would not create separation individuation. The mother is there forever. All of you have your mother here, whether you believe it or not. The introject is there. And so, this kind of mother does not allow separation individuation. There is shame, there is grief, and the child begins to react in a variety of ways. This situation needs to be resolved somehow. Excuse me for a second. This situation needs to be resolved somehow. So the child begins to react in a variety of ways. First, as I told you, the child invents an imaginary friend. Many children have imaginary friends. Imaginary friends are a form of what is known as transitory objects. They allow transition to object relations. So many children have imaginary friends. But this child's imaginary friend is God, or at least God-like. It's a divinity. So that's one solution. The second solution is a rejection of reality. Reality is too much. It's too painful, too hurtful, unbearable, intolerable. The child rejects reality. But when you reject reality, there's a vacuum. And to fill this vacuum, the child settles on fantasy. Fantasy is conceived as a defense, but it's not only a defense. So the child settles on fantasy. And one of the initial phases, one of the first phases of fantasy taking over, because this kind of child's fantasy metastasizes. This is cancer. The fantasy takes over completely. Everything, cognitions, emotions, affects, behaviors, traits, interactions, relationships, everything is consumed by this ever-expanding nebula of the fantasy, which metastasizes and leaves nothing untouched. Nothing untouched. And it starts small. Starts small like many bad things. It starts small. It starts with what is known as cognitive distortion. Cognitive distortion is a way to reframe reality or reconstruct it somehow that it becomes less painful, more acceptable, less hurtful. And the most famous cognitive distortion is, of course, grandiosity. Grandiosity is a cognitive distortion. It falsifies reality so that reality upholds and buttresses and supports an unrealistic, fantastic, inflated view of the self, a self-concept that is counterfactual. That's how the fantasy starts, small. I have a God, and I have a special relationship with God, and that makes me special. This process is known as co-idealization. Later on in life, this kind of adult, he would look for an intimate partner, and he would recreate this exactly. He would idealize the intimate partner, and by idealizing the intimate partner, he would idealize himself. If my intimate partner is perfect, if my intimate partner is drop-dead gorgeous, if my intimate partner is hyper-intelligent and unique and unprecedented and amazing, and so on and so forth, that makes me unique and amazing and unprecedented and so on, because I own her. She is my internal object. It's like owning a car, a luxury car. You know, it's a status symbol in a way. But there is this process of co-idealization that starts very, very early with the idealization of the false self. The child idealizes this imaginary friend, and then because it's a special relationship, like between the United Kingdom and the United States, it's a special relationship, then we have a situation that the child is also unique and special and essentially godlike. Because if God belongs to you, what does it say about you? If you invented God, what does it say about you? So this is how the fantasy starts. Essentially, children settle on one of two solutions. When I say children, remember, we're talking cluster B. We're talking children who become later adults with cluster B personality disorders. I just don't want to repeat this, it's very long, so I'm saying children. So these children settle, children with dead mothers and so on, they settle on one of two solutions. The first solution is known as the moral defense. The moral defense is a phrase coined by Fairbairn. You heard of Fairbairn? The moral defense is a phrase coined by Fairbairn, who was one of the main figures in the British object relation schools in the 60s and 70s. And Fairbairn suggested that what the child does, this kind of child, what the child does is the child says, I am all bad. Mommy rejects me, mommy frustrates me, but she is right because she is all good. I deserve to be punished. I am unlovable. It's true, what she's doing to me is just. That's the way she should behave. So the child assumes the responsibility, and this is a moral defense. The child says the situation is moral. It's not unethical, nothing wrong with it. It's totally moral. And that's a moral defense. And what the child does, the child internalizes a bad object. So the child has an object inside. Object is simply a constellation of voices, a cluster of introjects, cluster of voices. And this bad object is internal, and it informs the child, you're unlovable, you're unworthy, you're failure, you're ugly, you're stupid. You're a professor of psychology, you know. Okay. Just to wake you up from time to time. Actually, Strachey, another guy, in the 1930s already described this moral defense, 30 years before Fairbairn, and he called it the primitive superego. The primitive superego is internalization of these voices that tell you that you're bad and so on. Melanie Klein, who was very much into pornography, called it the good breast versus the bad breast. I leave it up to you to imagine the situation. Yes? The good breast versus the bad breast. And Moral defense is essentially good breast, a good breast strategy. There's the good breast versus the bad breast was how the child conceives of mother. There is the frustrating mother, the mother who wouldn't give the child food, or leaves the room, or is not present when the child cries. That's the frustrating mother. That's the bad breast. And then there's the good mother, the mother that feeds, and she's the good breast. Okay? So she made this distinction, good breast and bad. So this is a good breast strategy. Mother is all good, I am all bad. And in this sense, it's what we call a splitting defense. This strategy is an extended splitting defense, with the child assuming all the negativity and relegating to the mother all the positivity. That's one solution, and it is a solution common in borderline personality disorder. These people become, when they grow up, they develop borderline personality disorder. By the way, borderline personality disorder can be diagnosed as early as age 12. It's not the same with narcissistic personality disorder or psychopathy. These can be diagnosed earliest age 18 and preferably 21 plus. In psychopathy, we have a precedent, we have another condition, which is psychopathy for children, and it's called conduct disorder. So people with conduct disorder, some of them, a big percentage of them, go on to become psychopaths when they graduate. But we don't have such a thing in narcissism. Narcissism starts as a pathology, 18, 21, something like that. However, the roots of pathological narcissism, or pathological narcissism, not the disorder, pathological narcissism, starts much earlier. And it's commonly accepted that it starts around 2-3 years old. So this is the first type of defense. I'm all bad, mother is all good. The second type of defense is exactly the opposite. Mother is all bad, I'm all good. It's very uncommon for a child to say mother is all bad. If any child says mother is all bad, it's very frightening, it's threatening. If you have a mother who is bad, this mother will not feed you, will not protect you, will not pay attention to you, will not see you, you can die. So children usually don't do that. They don't say mother is all bad, I'm all good. This is an unusual situation. That's why narcissism is a much later phenomenon. Because narcissism requires this kind of splitting. I'm all good, everyone else is all bad. And a child cannot do that. A child cannot do that. So narcissism is a later phenomenon because this kind of splitting is essentially impossible in the first few years of life. But this is narcissism. I'm all good, everyone else is all bad. The bad breast defense, and there's an internalized, idealized object. Whereas in borderline and so on, you have an internalized bad object. In narcissism, you have both. You have an internalized bad object and a defense against the bad object, the idealized object. So the idealized object compensates. There is a compensatory structure. Narcissists, as opposed to borderlines, as distinct from borderlines, narcissists do not have a functioning self in any meaningful way. And definitely they don't have what Freud used to call ego and superego, and they don't have any of these structures. They're structureless, they're amorphous, they're totally amorphous, which explains why narcissists are highly adaptable and why they kind of go with the flow and they're kind of slimy, you cannot capture them. Because they are amorphous. Whereas in borderline, many of the personality structures are more advanced. Borderlines have access to positive emotions, too much access to positive emotions and so on. So there's a major distinction between the two. And Kernberg suggested that narcissism is a defense against borderline. He suggested that there's a terror of becoming borderline, and so the child develops narcissism as a defense against borderline. Grothstein, who was another psychoanalyst, suggested that borderline is failed narcissism. He said the child attempts to become a narcissist, and when the child fails to develop narcissism, the child remains stuck at the stage of emotional dysregulation and becomes a borderline. So they both agree Because Grossstein says that narcissism is a defense against the emotional dysregulation of the borderline. And so in their view, the stages are a dead mother, or dysfunctional mother or whatever, borderline, and then some children, very few, develop narcissistic defenses or narcissistic hyperstructure, and they become narcissists. So narcissists are like evolved borderlines. Next stage in evolution. And so this kind of child remains stuck. He is in a symbiotic state with his mother. Remember, mother doesn't have to be real, doesn't have to be alive. It's the mother introject. He is in a symbiotic. When I say he, she, I mean half of all cluster B personality disorders now we know are female and half are male. There have been severe gender bias until recently. We had a situation where majority of people with borderline personality disorder were diagnosed were women, and majority of narcissists were men. But today we know that was gender bias. Today we know that it's half and half, and it's really half and half. This is not politically correct. So these children grow up and they develop the bad breast defense or the good breast defense. They split one way or another, but they're all stuck. They're stuck in the symbiotic phase. They're merged and meshed with an internalized mother who is withholding, frustrating, aggressive, rejecting, and so on and so forth. And they naturally wish to get rid of this introject, to get rid of this nagging voice, of this internalized bad object, call it as you wish. And by the way, I'm using now, to talk to you, I'm using concepts from object relations schools and so on and so forth, but they have equivalence, absolute equivalence in much later theories. For example, in social cognitive theory, or social learning theory as it used to be called, we have the concept of modeling. Yes? So there is a modeling failure. There's a modeling failure in such children with the dead mother. The dead mother has a modeling failure, so the child cannot model, cannot create behaviors and cannot create conceptions of relationships and so on and so forth. So you see, whichever theory you choose, it's just a change in language, essentially. Just a change in language. I know that in the West today, it's not bon ton, it's faux pas to mention Freud and Jung, and it's you don't. And in many universities in the West, I teach in Cambridge, for example, it's strictly forbidden to mention Freud. I'm not kidding. I cannot mention Freud. I've had my curriculum, my syllabus cut by half because it included Freud and Jung and I don't know what. It's absolutely strictly forbidden to mention Freud and Donald Trump. These are the two names you cannot put. And I think it's a horrible mistake, because I think these are simply alternative languages. The insights are correct. It's just the languages are different. And to discard something just because you don't like the language, that's not exactly a sign of wisdom, to use another statement, in my view. So if you want to use social cognitive theory, then what I would have told you is that the dead mother fails to model. She doesn't provide a model, and there's a modeling failure. Yes, if you want to use this language. But it's all the same. So the child remains stuck. And there's this introject of the mother. There's a voice of the mother. Call it whatever you will. The mother is present somehow, not in a good way. The child needs to get rid of a mother. How to get rid of this? Separation, individuation. The child failed to separate from the mother, failed to become an individual, and now the child needs to do that. The child could be 64 years old, but he still needs to do it, So, and to do that, what do you need? If you want to separate from mother and become an individual finally, what do you need? Sorry?
To reject the mother.
You need a mother. If you want to separate from a mother, it would be helpful to have a mother to separate from. So you need a mother. And this leads us to the shared fantasy. Before we go to the shared fantasy, I'll mention Bella Grunberger. Yeah. I mentioned Bella Grunberger. He was a psychologist, a psychoanalyst actually, and he came up with the concept of narcissistic elation. Narcissistic elation is what Freud used to call oceanic feeling. You see, it just changes in language. That's all. It means the feeling of becoming one with usually the mother figure, but not always. Becoming one with another person. This unity that we all aspire to, a state of nirvana and merger and fusion and so on, is actually, I'm sorry to inform you, a severe pathology. So, narcissistic elation or oceanic feeling and so on is the driving force behind this wish to find a mother. Because the precondition for separation individuation is to first be one with the mother. If you're not one with the mother, you don't need to separate from her. So in order to reenact, because this process is called reenactment, there's a reenactment of early childhood conflicts. So in order to reenact early childhood conflicts or early childhood dynamics, you need to replicate them from zero. So you need to find a mother, you need to merge with her and fuse with her, you need to have enmeshment, you need to have a symbiotic phase, you need to have a narcissistic elation and so on, and only then you can proceed to the next stage, and the next stage is separation. Shared fantasy is not my concept, I regret to say. It was first described by Sander, S-A-N-D-E-R, in 1989. And it was Sander who suggested that when we enter relationships, not necessarily intimate. So if you have a good friend, the same dynamic. The good friend becomes the maternal figure. Even if you have a boss, the boss becomes the maternal figure. You impose this kind of children who have had, a dead mother, they impose a maternal view of others. They convert everyone into mothers, And so, for example, they become very entitled. They become very demanding because mother owes me, I'm a child. As a child, I deserve special treatment. I deserve protection. I deserve concessions. I'm a child. And as a child, you should never hurt me because it's not okay to hurt children, So whatever I do to you, you should tolerate and accept because as a mother, you should love me unconditionally. This is the expectations and they apply to everything. Not only intimate relationships. So the shared fantasy is a global concept of human relationships in cluster B psychopathologies. And again, not mine, it is Sander's. And so it has various phases. But before we go to the various phases, I would like to clarify that shared fantasy in the case of borderline is very different to the shared fantasy in the case of the narcissist. In the case of the borderline, the fantasy is object-oriented. In other words, in the case of the borderline, the fantasy is centered on another person, on another human being. So the borderline, for example, is likely to create a fantasy centered around an intimate partner, or a special friend, or a special person. There's this concept, special person, in borderline. So the borderline would create a fantasy around a specific individual, a real one, recognized as external. And then the fantasy would revolve around that person. That person would make her life perfect, would regulate her emotions, stabilize her moods. That person is the rock. He's like a rock, He will ground her. That person will ground her. So this is the borderline's fantasy. Whereas the narcissist fantasy is process-oriented, not other-oriented. In other words, as far as the narcissist is concerned, who you are is utterly irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. Whether you're empathic or nice or not nice, it's completely not relevant because the narcissist is focused on the process. You just happen to be there. You're a placeholder. You're an icon, an avatar. You represent the mother. In other words, we say that in the case of narcissism, pathological narcissism, it is an economy of representations. The main units in the exchange are representations, while with the borderline, the main units are regulation and other people. The borderline is really focused on other people. And she's focused on regulation. The narcissist couldn't care less who you are. You're interchangeable. You're dispensable. You're nobodies. You're commodified. Totally. That's why when I go online and I see all these victims, and I was special, I was chosen because I was super empathic, I was not. I understand, you need to feel good about what has happened to you, but that's not true. It's counterfactual. And so I would like to elaborate a bit on the very concept of fantasy before we go into the shared fantasy. Start with the fact that fantasies are unrealistic. They defy reality. They are counterfactual. They are not factual, not based on facts. And in this sense, many fantasies are delusional. Now, the difference between fantasy and delusion is that delusion provokes aggression when it is challenged. When you challenge a delusion, you end badly. And in some cases, you end not being. Delusions are fiercely protected. Fantasies are not. So the only difference is what kind of reaction they trigger. A fantasy is a narrative. It's a story. So it has a beginning, an end, a middle. It has a plot. It has characters. It's exactly like a movie script or a theater production. It's a regulatory mechanism. People who are prone to fantasy use fantasies to regulate internal processes. It's a form of self-supply. So through the fantasy, you can cater to your needs which are not met otherwise. So for example, you need attention and you're not getting attention, so you create a fantasy where you are getting attention. It could be, therefore, a paranoid fantasy. Paranoia is actually narcissism. It's a form of narcissism because it's a fantasy in which you are getting attention by the CIA, by the government, by I don't know who. You are getting attention. So this is a compensatory fantasy. It's a compensatory role. Fantasy is a defense against fragility and vulnerability. When you are inside the fantasy, you can be anything you want. You can be all-powerful. You can be all-knowing. You can be untouchable. You can be invulnerable. You can be infinite. You can have a fantasy you'll never die. It's known as religion. A fantasy is a time machine because it, in almost in all cases, involves regression. Fantasies involve regression to an infantile state. Back to the womb, kind of. Back to the womb. Back to the matrix. So fantasies involve symbiosis. They have what Grunberger called the elation, narcissistic elation, oceanic feeling, that you're becoming one with someone. But that is the feeling of a baby. So when you're in fantasy, you're infantilizing, you're regressing automatically. And when you're in a shared fantasy, when you find someone who participates with you in the fantasy, agrees to be your counterparty in the fantasy, both of you become children. Both of you infantilize. It's not possible for someone to be a partner in my shared fantasy if she refuses to become an infant, because she needs to regress with me. Okay? As an example. That was an example. A fantasy is a good object, always. So within the fantasy, you're good. You're worthy. You're lovable. It's very rare to have a fantasy where you are ugly and stupid, and that's it's unusual to have such a fantasy. A fantasy is a cognitive distortion. It's a misperception of reality and involves other cognitive distortions. And finally, a fantasy is a pseudo-emotion. It's euphoric. So as you can see, when the narcissist and the psychopath and they all engage in fantasies, when they engage in fantasies, there's a huge list of psychological needs that are met by the fantasy. It's not just saying, fantasy because I cannot tolerate reality. That's one aspect. But there are many other aspects, which I just mentioned. Many, many psychological needs. We could say that fantasies are total solutions. They're total solutions. So if reality is too much for you, not acceptable, this, that, your total solution is a fantasy. And that's why more and more people devolve into fantasy in our current world, in contemporary society, in civilization. We devolve into fantasy. We have whole industries based on fantasy, movies, social media, they're all based on fantasies. They're all fantasy based. So because it's a total solution. There's no element in you, psychological element, that is not catered to by the fantasy, that is not taken care of by the fantasy, that the fantasy doesn't gratify. No such thing. The Euclidean principles say I'm abandoning reality altogether and I'm emigrating to fantasy land. And many people did that in the past. Utopia. You know, the word utopia means no such place. Utopia. No such place. So fantasy is not a new thing, but in the case of the narcissist, a fantasy is a ritual, it's choreographed, it has strict phases, and these phases are inexorable and immutable, never changing. In other words, the narcissist is not in control of the fantasy. The fantasy is in control of the narcissist. The fantasy determines behavior, regulates, and affords what we call hermeneutic input. In other words, the fantasy provides meaning, makes sense of the world, makes sense of life, and provides meaning. I'm sorry that I'm mentioning religion all the time, but you see immediately the similarities. I mean, it's inevitable. It's very clear. So let's discuss the 7 stages of the narcissist shared fantasy. Is it a fantasy to think that we've been talking for 1 hour? Or is it reality?
Hi.
I hate reality. 10 minutes because we are way behind the material. 10 minutes, guys. Please, not longer.